Okay, welcome to Interpreting Contemporary Culture for the last time. This is session 10, our cultural responsibility. This whole session is going to really be looking not so much at the academic, which we have covered over the majority of this class, but really the practical, ultimately the pursuit of a greater cultural quotient or living for the next generation of culture is how it lives and moves and has its being in and through our lives. So, this particular session really will be about 7 practical tips that I want to give you that certainly were touched on throughout the semester and even recently in some of your reading. But maybe 7 of the highlights for me as I send you out, hopefully, to be practicing uh, a continued posture of interpreting contemporary culture and culture for the next generation. So the goal, as I have said, is really practice, 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 practice. We're not going to get any better at interpreting culture or engaging the next generation of culture if we're not doing it. Livermore says there's no such thing as achieving perfect cultural intelligence by reading a couple of books, taking a class, or going through a set of experiences. It's a lifelong quest of becoming more Christ-like in how we interact with those unlike us. So, in other words, you've done this class. Good for you. You've read some books, you've done some articles, you've written a paper, and all of those are fantastic, really wonderful things. But this is a lifelong quest. This is a journey that you're on, and I would certainly hope that one of the things that this class has instilled in you is that interpreting culture for the next generation uh, is really is really an ongoing process. Culture is going to change and shift around you, and you're going to have some really practical ideas in your mind about what you want to accomplish and continue to practice your cultural quotient. Our responsibility. We have an enormous responsibility. We've come full circle in this conversation of raising our cultural awareness, our CQ. We began by talking about why this whole idea of engaging culture to interpret it and look at it through the eyes of wanting to reach the next generation is important. And the conclusion that we came to was because we have been called by God to love people and bring good news to any and every culture He has set us in. And we want to be able to do that well. So our responsibility is quite simply to do CQ, to do cultural quotient. As we conclude our sessions together, the answer hasn't changed. The responsibility remains the same. We cannot simply talk about pursuing cultural quotient or reading books on how good CQ is for one's life and ministry. We have to do CQ. So let me give you 7 practical tips on hopefully how you can make this a part of your everyday life. Tip number 1. Become increasingly self-aware. People around the world can look with disdain upon the United States because as a whole, Americans have little self-awareness. The tendency is to be caught up in our own stuff to the extent that we miss what is happening around us. So become more culturally and self-aware. Self-awareness will help us relate with people. It will help us create healthy boundaries and provide for better opportunities with people. So look at the opportunities self-awareness brings you. Healthy boundaries in your life. What are the things for you personally, for you corporately, in your ministry life, maybe in your family boundaries. But as you engage different cultures, self-awareness is going to help you relate with people. Secondly, and this comes from reading in Keller, Keller raises an issue of self-awareness that I want to revisit just shortly. Self-awareness is boosted by knowing what your own cultural influences are. where you studied, who key leaders are in your life, um, or were in your life. Maybe it's your parents, etc., etc. What are the key cultural influences? Um, if you can answer what the key cultural influences are on you already, then you have an increased self-awareness. And of course, as I've already said, increased self-awareness is going to help you build healthy boundaries, provide opportunities to better engage with people. Number 2, become more and more in love with Jesus. Become more and more in love with Jesus. Personal spiritual growth will lead to our becoming less and Christ becoming more. It opens the door for our love for others, unlike us, and grants us opportunity to communicate the gospel. So we have to have spiritual growth. We have to have gospel-shaped hearts, what Keller calls gospel-shaped hearts. Keller raises that issue that if we want to see our cultural quotient rise, then we have to have hearts that are shaped by Jesus and the gospel. We don't need approval from our culture. We don't need approval from other people. What we recognize is that we are more and more in love with Jesus, and being more and more in love with Jesus drives us to want to engage cultures and people of different cultures more and better. Number 3, third tip, view people how God views them. There's not another human being that you've ever laid eyes on that is not loved by God. Every butcher, baker, and candlestick maker has imprinted on his or her life the image of God. So, it's our responsibility to love them, not simply so we can try to engage them in hopes of converting them, but because they bear God's image. We engage them not just so that we can check them off on some list or say that we've gone out and tried to raise our cultural quotient. That's really not the issue. The issue is we love them because they bear God's image. Think about it this way. The story of mankind bearing God's image becomes the story of Scripture. We were created in the image of God. We were images of God Himself. We become cracked images. Then eventually, as the story begins to pursue, God gives us an opportunity to pursue oneness with Him, ourself in Him, but ourself in community with others. You see, we can't fully, in this age of redemption, be His image without the community. And so we are His in community. We accept then faith of the perfect image bearer, and we become part of His kingdom community. And then we are His image in the world. And then eventually, at the very end of all things, we experience oneness with God and others in heaven. And we are His image there as He is there with us. So we view people from the lens of God, or at least we attempt to try and view people with the same kind of value and respect that God has for them. The fourth tip is this. Quite frankly, we have to get our hands dirty. Livermore said transformation occurs when we begin to do life together with those who are not like us. The underpinning of cultural intelligence is not cerebral understanding of different cultures. It's love. And let me tell you, love gets its hands dirty. We cannot improve our cultural quotient if we do not engage and have around us people who are different than us. At some point, we have to begin to smell like sheep. At some level, there has to be a consistent and concerted effort to immerse ourselves in the lives of others who differ from us. If we want to lead sheep, we have to smell like one. Keller writes this, truth should not be simply declared into a vacuum. It must be delivered as a response to the questions of particular people. And this means understanding their culture, which one is incapable of doing if there is no interaction with that culture. That last sentence was mine. But it's implied in the reading. We can't simply declare into a vacuum something. It has to be declared into a response of questions that people have of understanding their culture. And I'm incapable of doing that if no if I have no cultural interaction. In other words, I have to get my hands dirty. Number 5, listen carefully. We've talked about a lot of this throughout the course of the semester, but listening really is going to equal success. Knowing the people can and probably will be the difference between success and failure in leading veins of ministry anywhere in the world. If you want success in ministry, whether that's preaching or teaching, whether that's in youth ministry or missions or urban or rural settings, whatever the culture might be, we have to be willing to sit down and listen to the people that we're encountering. Maybe they're different than us, but we're not going to be able to love them better, not only if we don't get our hands dirty, but if we're not listening to what they're really saying. Keller writes, ultimately the most important source for learning will be the hours and the hours spent in close relationships with people, listening to them carefully. Listening equals success. It's what Paul does in Athens, in Jerusalem, and Corinth, and Philippi. It's what Jesus does when he is speaking with Gentiles and Jews. They know their listeners. They know their desires and wants and needs and aspirations and fears and beliefs and values and questions. And we have to do no less. I know I try and understand you and listen to what your perspective is on a class or in your life or your perspective on homework even. This is the culture that we're a part of. This is an academic culture. So I am trying to listen to you to make the in-class experience the best that it possibly can. In any ministry that we're in, we have to be listening carefully to the people around us. Otherwise, the ministry isn't going to go very well. Let me give you an example. Jason Epperson, successful alum here in his ministry life. He's been a team chaplain for the Illinois and football and basketball teams. And one thinks, wow, how does a guy, well, any guy, get involved with something like that? Well, it was perfect. Jason had already immersed himself in those two cultures. He knew them, he understood them, he knew their values and beliefs, he knew the questions that they had. He knew them and how to communicate with them. And he was listening long enough that he was able to have a good tenure doing lots of a variety of things, including being a chaplain. And he was asked back continually because he was listening to the culture. Not only did he go in and get his hands dirty, he was listening for opportunities of engagement. Number six, we have to look intently for truth and value. This goes a little bit back to the lecture we had last week, so I won't belabor the point. But we have to find what is valuable and take advantage of it. We have to take advantage of what is already there. Much like Paul does in Athens, he takes a bit of truth that he can find in the Athens culture and he builds upon it to try and point them in the direction of Jesus Christ. We have to find what's valuable in a culture and take advantage of what the people already know and value so that we can show them their greatest needs and desires, ultimately so we can point them in the way of Christ and his kingdom. I would also say that we probably need to do this for ourselves. Take a look at what's valuable around us and then determine what's ultimately valuable. Finally, I want to look at the practical tip of just keeping our eyes and ears open. This is perhaps maybe one that you just simply have to intuitively find. There's no book, there's no list. It's just cultural quotient common sense. While it may be impossible to put in one document all there is to do in life to improve cultural quotient, this is certainly a common sense practice that will get us ever closer to the goal of learning to love others differently and better. You see, life is full of opportunities. We need to find them. Look around you. I know that Livermore, in the end of his chapter 15, begins to look at all sorts of different things. Maybe it's reading a book or going to the movie or eating at a place we haven't eaten or inviting someone over to eat a meal with us. It's different than their culture. And then reciprocating that and going to a meal with them that's different than our culture. Maybe on a top end scale, it would be learning a new language or enjoying the celebrations of others. Maybe it's trying to look at and be worldly aware of what's going on in the world. Kind of a social science of just being aware of what's out there. Maybe it's when we have the opportunity to be overseas, we don't assume that we know it all and we speak slowly. All sorts of different things. We just simply have to keep our eyes and ears peeled and be ready for the opportunities that are going to come across our table. So, having said all of this, my final encouragement to you in this class, I hope, is to engage those things that may be different from what you are used to, but do them with a vision of engaging and loving others who are different than you, so that you can love them better, so that you can fulfill the mission that God has called you into in whatever culture He sets you inside of. So in this way, I hope you go and interpret well contemporary culture.